It's my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Feinstein, our illustrious rabbi here at BBS. Just a little bit of background in case you already didn't know, but he's on the faculty of Ziegler Rabbinical School of the American Jewish University, the Wexner Heritage Program, the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He lectures. He's a member of the board of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles, member of the school board of Milken's Community Schools, and an active member of APAC. And he's here today at last minute, thank you, to continue a discussion about when the world shifts beneath your feet. Things are changing. So Rabbi, help educate us.
Everybody in my world is sick, and I woke up this morning with a sniffle. I don't think it's anything more than a sniffle, but let's let the doctor. So I'm going to stay way away from all of you. I wasn't sure that the title was one of those titles that rabbis use when they don't know what they want to talk about. And as much as Jerry did a beautiful thing on his screen this morning, I thought I would do something in the area of religion that you're going to find shocking and disturbing and unnerving. Is that okay? I want to talk about Christmas. So can you I grew up in a very Jewish home. You probably grew up in a similar home where Christmas was treif. And anything having to do with Christmas wasn't just not us. It was like poisonous. It was toxic. It was, don't touch it. It's illegal. It's out of the. So, you know, we never looked at any of this stuff. We saw it all around us. I went to public school. I know all the words to all the songs. Went to public school, we had Christmas trees and other things, but in school. My brothers and I came home once late in December, and we said to my mother, we want a Christmas tree. Because we're the only kids on the block who don't have one. And everyone else has one, and why should we be left out? And we go to Hebrew school, we're not going to become Christians. We just want a Christmas tree. And we made the case, Mom, it's not a religious object. It's just a beautiful thing. And my mother, who's very wise, said, okay. And we said, yeah, okay. You know, with the tinsel and the star and the ornaments. And she said, yeah, you can have all that. All of that in July. Which was very wise, because if you have a tree in your house in July, it's a pretty thing. It's just that when you put it in your house in December, it becomes something more controversial. It becomes something more associated with Christian faith. So what I thought I'd do today, and I want to do this with great respect, in no way try to undermine or disrespect Christian. Everyone got on these sheets, one of these sheets? Yeah. Okay. In no way do I want to undermine or disrespect this, but I think it's important for us to recognize that this Christian tradition grew out of our tradition. And there are roots within our own tradition that raise all sorts of interesting implications about how we experience this holiday. So let's begin with the basic history of the thing, okay? Christian community really becomes a self-conscious religious community in the 3rd century, in the 200s. That's when a community of Jews and some others who had attached themselves to that community began to call themselves Christian and begin to organize themselves as a separate faith. It wasn't until the 3rd century that Christianity pulled away from Judaism. Up until that point, it was a species of Judaism. In fact, in the New Testament, which is the Christian Bible, there's an episode in the book of Acts, which is the story of what happened after the death of Jesus of Nazareth. There's a story there about an argument. It's an argument that took place in the Jerusalem community. It's called in the Bible the Jerusalem Church, but it's a community between two sets of advocates. On the one side was Paul and Barnabas, and the other side was Peter and James. Translation: Peter is Shaul, Saul, and James is Yitzchak. Okay, And Saul is also Saul. I'm sorry. Peter is whatever. Saul is Paul is Saul, and these are Jews. And the question was, is Christianity to be a species of Judaism, or is it to be a separate faith altogether? And the determining factor was circumcision. Because what happened was that Paul, who had gotten the Christian message after the death of Jesus, became the evangelist, which is a fancy word of saying the guy who was going out and spreading this news to the world. And he was finding great success with with Gentiles, with pagans, Greeks, Romans, who were interested in monotheism, but didn't find a home in the synagogue. And Paul was bringing them in Christian communities. But the question is, did you have to be circumcised? You can imagine that making somebody requiring circumcision might be an obstacle, especially because in those days, circumcision was not performed with Teflon-coated, sterilized surgical knives. You're talking about a sharp piece of flint, you know, and for adults with no anesthesia, or analgesics. You're talking about some serious surgery here. So the question is, and the deeper question is Christianity a species of Judaism, or is it not? And it was at that point in the 3rd century that the Christian church decided you don't have to be circumcised. At that point, they decided that Christianity will no longer count itself as a part of Judaism, and they broke away. Some of the moves they made, for example, there was a holiday in the springtime that celebrated the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and it was called Pesach, and it was celebrated with a meal with flat bread. And they moved it off of Pesach, and they called it Easter, after the Middle Eastern goddess of fertility, Astarte, and they took away the flat bread. They also they moved Shabbat from Saturday to Sunday. And so they took affirmative religious moves to move the two communities separate from each other. But then, just to finish out this long story, it was after that the church turned on the Jewish community. And the reason they turned on the Jewish community was the fact that we were an embarrassment to them. After all, if they're going to the Romans, they're going to the Greeks, they're going to the peoples of the Middle East and Europe, and saying, bring you the good news of the arrival of God's Messiah. And the simple question was, well, if it really happened, why aren't his own family converting to this faith? We become an embarrassment to them. See how that works? So not only do they separate from us, but they turn on us. And the resentment against the Jewish community for not accepting the word of this new faith, the resentment against that, and the difficulty that they had explaining why we're still Jewish, we who were the family of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Why we're still Jewish and haven't accepted him as Messiah. It's turned into a species of first resentment, and then contempt, and ultimately hatred. There are some interesting caveats about this. This is actually good enough to be worthy of one of Jerry's wonderful presentations. If you ever open up the Encyclopedia Judaica, open up the article on Chinese Jew. Chinese Jews. So here's what happens in the medieval church. The Christian community of the Middle Ages, believed that the Torah contained a prophecy about Jesus coming, but that we, in our evil, satanic, demonic conspiracy, we erased those verses from the Torah. So the church sent missionaries all over the world, particularly to far-flung Jewish communities, to find Torah scrolls that might not have been doctored, that might still contain those original prophecies of Jesus of Nazareth. And two missionaries from Venice ended up in China in the 11th century, early, like when Marco Polo went, and they found Jews living in China. Now, Jews were living in China because there was a trade route called the Silk Road that they were part of. So these two monks go to the synagogue and they want to see the Torah because they want to see where the verses are. And to their chagrin, they don't find those verses about Jesus in the Torah because, of course, there are no verses about Jesus in the Torah. But they come back to Venice with a remarkable record of Chinese Jewish life. And the most wonderful thing is they wrote out in Hebrew letters the prayers that Chinese Jews said. And they said, Re'oram Va'ed. It's written that way. I mean, so this is the kind of resentment and contempt that went on between the two communities. So let's go back to the beginning now. The early church, that is the early years of Christian life, you have a group of guys, call them the church fathers. They were the ones responsible for putting together this Jesus story and making a faith out of it. They were the ones who authored the Christmas story. Okay, the Christmas story doesn't really become a thing until the second, third century. It takes a while for it. The third or fourth century. It takes a while for it to get going. Now, all of those church fathers are Jewish, so they're going to draw from different themes of Jewish tradition to create the Christmas story. Let's take a look. The first question is the whole sort of background of birth of the Christ child, right? And the background comes from the prophets. So here we have two prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Those are our prophets. They're in our Bible. Jeremiah, you'll see this is Jeremiah 31. It's at the end of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah begins prophesying in the last days of the first temple of Jerusalem. So he begins prophesying about the year 620 BCE. The temple will be destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. He prophesies for about 40 years before the temple is destroyed. And his mission is to tell the Jewish people, change your ways, repent your sins, and God will spare you. God will not allow the temple to be destroyed. The people did not change. They did not repent their sins. On the contrary, they put Jeremiah in jail. Then the Babylonians came and destroyed the city as he had predicted. And on the day that he witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, as he had predicted it for 40 years, his prophecy changed 180 degrees. Instead of becoming a person who warned the Jews about the destruction that was coming, started offering reconciliation. Here's hope in the face of this catastrophe. And one of his prophecies of hope is this one. A time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Now, just to be clear, the Hebrew Bible is the Tanakh, right? Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The Christian community assembled the teachings of Jesus, his story in the three historical gospels, and then the story of Jesus in the more mystical gospel of John. And together with the book of Acts, there's 5 principal books. Does that sound familiar? 5 principal books. And then a whole bunch of letters from this fellow named Paul. Wherever Paul went, he communicated with the churches that he visited. And so the letters of Paul are all named for the communities he was visiting. So when he went to the town of Corinth, that book is called Corinthian. When he went to Thessalonica, that book is Thessalonians. And when he went to Rome, that book is called Romans. And when he talked to the Jews in Jerusalem, that book is called Hebrews. Those are the books of the Christian Bible, the Christian New Testament. And then there's a few writings at the end. They mimic the structure of the Hebrew Bible in adding it to our Bible. And that they called it, now we call it in English, Old Testament and New Testament. Testament is testimony. It means truth. Old truth, new truth. See the picture? That's why Jews don't refer to our Bible as Old Testament, because it's an acknowledgement. It's old, not meaning that it's like ancient. It's old meaning it's not in force anymore. It's old, not good anymore. In Hebrew, the name of the Christian Bible is New Covenant. Rita Hadashah. I was approached by a missionary on the streets of Tel Aviv, of all places, and he handed me a Christian Bible in Hebrew, and on the cover it says Brita Chadashah, the New Covenant, the New Covenant, and that's where then they get that from here, from Jeremiah. So Jeremiah says to his people, now 500 years before Jesus walked the world, I will make a new covenant with you. It won't be like the covenant I made with their fathers when I took them by and lead them out of Egypt, the covenant which they broke, though I espoused them. But such covenant I'll make with Israel after these days. I'll put my teaching in their innermost being and inscribe it on their hearts. That is actually an interesting summary of what Christian theology is going to offer. A new covenant, not based in law which you can either observe or ignore, but a new covenant which is sort of written in the heart. It becomes a commitment of the soul without the law attached to it. That's going to be Paul's idea. Similar idea, if you look at the next prophet, Ezekiel, who lives in exile, he lives in Babylon, says, I will gather you from peoples and assemble you out of the countries you've been scattered, and give you the land of Israel. They return there, do away with the detestable things, and I will give them one heart and put a new spirit in them. Okay, Ruach, a new spirit. And I will remove the heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. So this idea that God would come into the world, see the decrepit state of the Jewish people, and even more than that, the decrepit state of humanity, take mercy on us, have Rahmanas on us, and give us a new covenant, because we couldn't manage to keep the old one. That which is the core Christian message already comes from the Hebrew Bible. That was already predicted from the Hebrew Bible. So what happens? Well, you have a moment around the year zero. There is such a Augustus is the emperor of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is beginning to crack, even under Augustus. And there is a sense that something is about to happen in the world. In Israel, you have many different preachers running around Israel, preaching different versions of Judaism. And one of the versions is taught by a young fellow who starts in the Galilee, Nazareth, which is in the north, where all crazy ideas come from. Okay? Gathers a following, comes down to Jerusalem, preaches his message in Jerusalem. And because he's coming to Jerusalem on Pesach was the pilgrimage holiday. And on that pilgrimage holiday, the city of Jerusalem would swell from 10,000 to 100,000 people. It was an incredible tourist moment, right? So Jews from all over the Mediterranean would find their way to Jerusalem on Passover. So if you're a preacher from Galilee and you want to make an impression on the Jewish world, that's where you've got to go. And he comes into Jerusalem and he begins to preach his message that the messianic time has arrived, that the Messiah has arrived. Now, whether he said he was the Messiah or whether he was just saying the Messiah is arriving any moment now, it's a little unclear because we don't have a record of what he actually said. We have what they said he said years and years and years later. But one way or the other, he catches the attention of the Roman police, who were very worried about 100,000 pissed off, angry Jews, and very worried that there's going to be a revolt against them, which there was eventually. And so the Romans have him arrested, and they want to make an example of him. This is what happens when you deny the power of the emperor, and so they crucify him. Crucifixion was not a normal thing. Crucifixion was done for political reasons, because it's a horrible death, and it's slow. It's in order to make an impression. So you didn't, I mean, if you were just a crook, they would just chop your head off or do something else. They crucified people who were political opponents of the emperor. And so Jesus's crime was denying the authority of the emperor. It was a political crime. And he gets himself crucified. And then from his followers gathered together, they begin to formulate an idea. And let me just stop for a second. The shock of that moment must have been awfully terrible. I mean, how could such a person who was preaching love, who was preaching kindness, who was preaching charity, who was preaching goodness, how could such a person end up crucified? I can tell you a silly story. This is a silly example, and I don't mean to in any way denigrate the Christian moment, but my experience of this was, I was living in New York City on the night that John Lennon was killed. And I remember, this is a very vague, I was typing, remember the old days when you wrote a term paper on a yellow pad, and then you had to type it, right? So I had a term paper. It was actually my last term paper in graduate school. I was taking a class in moral philosophy, moral education at Columbia. And I had a class, I had a paper I written, good paper, and I'm sitting, it was a like day of warm after evening, and I'm sitting in we have a back bedroom where we cleared off the desk, and that's where my typewriter was. And I was typing the paper, and I was listening to the radio, and the window was open. And all of a sudden, I hear someone sort of gasp in the building. And I listened to the radio, and the guy broke into the music of the radio. He says, "Terrible news today. John Lennon is outside of Dakota. We lived on 72nd Street in Central Park West." And John Lennon was known in New York City for being this very, very, very gentle, sweet guy, who'd go out for a walk with his kid. He had just donated 20,000 bulletproof vests to the police department. They needed bulletproof vests, and the city was too poor to give it to them. So he donated them. And so the guy comes out and says, John Lennon was just like, and then a few minutes later, comes on again, he said, John Lennon's been just right there. And then a few minutes later, he comes on again and said, there's 100,000 people in Central Park, right across the street from the place where it happened. There was this sense of how could such a gentle, kind guy who just made beautiful music and wanted to raise his kid, how could this happen? Right? When Martin Luther King was killed, he had the same response. How could this happen when John Kennedy was killed? This sense of somebody who'd given so much of themselves to society, how could it happen? So you imagine that the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth must have brought the same response in his followers. And so they began to create an ideology, a myth, a story that said, this is part of God's plan. This was part of God's plan. That God's plan involved him. That's where they began to say he wasn't just a person, he was the Messiah. And if he was the Messiah, why would God allow a Messiah to be killed? Because his death was a sacrifice. And they began to form out of that trauma of his loss the ideology of Christianity. Got that so far? Right? So, and the question of the resurrection is a really interesting question. They tell the story about the resurrection, but there's three different stories, depending on which of the Gospels you read. So it's clear that it wasn't a simple historical moment. It was probably meant as a metaphor. The idea being that what was essence of him didn't die at that moment. And now they begin to put together a myth, a story about him. They start to put together stories about him. Now, where did they get the material for these stories? Very few stories are original in the world. I don't know if you do watch television, but if you do watch television, you know that you've seen the same story on television in 100 different shows. Just they recycle the same stories, right? So but they were Jews. So where would they get the material? From Jewish folklore. So take a look. You ready with me here? This is from Genesis Rabbah. Genesis Rabbah is a midrash, a collection of midrash that was put together, gathered, and edited in the 5th century. But the material is much older than that. And this is the story of the birth of Father Abraham, right? When our father Abraham was born, a star rose in the east and swallowed 4 stars in the 4 corners of the heaven. King Nimrod's wizards, Nimrod was the king of Haran, where Abraham lived. King Nimrod, today it's the name of a sandal company in Israel. by Nimrod's sandals. They're really good. Nimrod's wizard said to him, to Terach at this hour a son has been born, of whom will issue a people destined to inherit this world and the world to come. With your permission, let his father be given a house full of silver and gold on condition that the newly born son be slain. Nimrod sent word to Terach, last night a son was born to you, now give him to me that we may slay him, and I fill your house with silver and gold. Why do cultures tell stories about miraculous births? Because what they want to do is to encode in the birth narrative all the clues to who he's going to become later. So Abraham, who is going to teach the world that there is one God, he is born with a star in the east, okay? And King Nimrod is afraid of him because if there's one God, what does that do to Nimrod? Nimrod's now demoted. It's just the king. It's not God. So the idea that the child is born miraculously and threatens the political authority, that is part of this sort of trope. It's part of this cultural theme. No surprise, we find the same story about Moses. You ready? This is from Exodus Rabbah, 5th century collection of midrashim of interpretive stories about Exodus, right? In the 130th year of Israel's exile in Egypt, Pharaoh dreamed that he was sitting upon a throne. He saw an old man before him with a balance in his hand. He saw him take all the elders, nobles, and great men of Egypt, tie them together, lay them on one side of the balance, and he put a tender kid on the other. The kid poured down in the pan in which he lay, and it hung lower than the other bound Egyptians. Pharaoh rose in the morning, called together his wise men to interpret the dream. Bilam spoke and said, this means a great evil will strike Egypt. A son will be born in Israel who will destroy the whole of our land. Okay, right? Ready for the miracle birth? Amnon is Moses' father, was very uneasy about his wife's being with child, because of course they're throwing baby boys into the Nile. So he knew not what to do. He turned to God in prayer. God had mercy on him, exhorted him not to despair. Know that the child whose birth the Egyptians have dreaded is your kid. Mazel tov. He will remain concealed from those who want to destroy him. When he's grown up, in a miraculous way, he will deliver the Hebrew nation from the distress that they're under. He will be celebrated while the world lasts, not only among Hebrews, but among strangers also. And this shall be the effect of my love toward thee and thy posterity. During the pregnancy, Yocheved, that's Moshe's mother, observed that the child in her womb was destined for great things, like every Jewish mother, right? At that time, she suffered no pain, and she suffered none in giving birth to her son. Yocheved gave birth to the child 6 months after conception. Well, I don't know. He's the doctor. Don't ask me, right? At the moment of the child's appearance, the whole house was filled with radiance, equal to the splendor of the sun and the moon. A still greater miracle followed. The infant was not a day old when he began to walk and speak with his parents. Spoke in Japanese, no doubt, right? As though he were an adult. He refused to drink milk from his mother's breast, right? He's modest, right? Now, what do you get? It's a miraculous birth story. Why do you tell a miraculous birth story? Because you want to say that the adult's career was foreshadowed in the moment of the child's birth. Okay? What's the Christian story? Well, I'll give it to you in a second. The Christian story is that King Herod, who was a half-Jewish king, client of the Romans, declared a census. And he declared that every Jewish family needs to return to their hometown in order to be counted, rolled in the census rolls of that hometown. Joseph and Miriam, lived in Nazareth, which is in the north. But Yosef came from Bethlehem, which is in the south. So he had to come down to Bethlehem in order to be counted in the census. But Nebuch, his poor wife, was 9 months pregnant. So they came down to Bethlehem, and because people were moving around, getting into their towns, there wasn't any room in any hotel, right? Even Best Western was closed. And that's why Nebuch, the kid, was born in a barn. Manger is a trough that you use to feed cows, right? The lowest of the low. Now, just as a historical note for a minute, anyone been to Israel in December? Anyone been to Israel in December? What's it like? Cold, rainy, snowy, rainy, snowy. You can't get from Nazareth. I can. We were there when I was a student. My parents came to visit me. I was studying at the university. We had a car, and it was hard to get from Nazareth to Bethlehem in a car on paved roads with markers because it snows and you can't find the road because it rains and the roads wash out. That couldn't have happened in December. When could it have happened? When would it make sense to have a census? Or Pesach, when everyone's coming to Jerusalem anyway. So the truth is he was probably born in Pesach, right? Probably born in the spring because you can't get, the roads are impassable in December. But this is the story. Now, why would they choose December to have him be born? Remember the Father Abraham story? The star in the east? Remember the Moses story? The house fills with light? This is the winter solstice. The winter solstice is the time when the night is longest and the day is shortest. What's going on among our non-Jewish pagan neighbors? They believe that the gods of the night are overcoming the gods of the day. And so what they want to do is to reinforce the gods of light in daytime. So they lit giant bonfires in the middle of towns, and everyone put candles and lights in their windows and their homes. You burn a log in your hearth all night long in order to strengthen the gods of the day in their fight against the gods of the night. That was the pagan holiday at the winter solstice. Anyone recognize that today? Anyone seen any lights outside during these days? Right? Both the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition fastened upon the winter solstice and made holidays out of it. The rabbis of the tradition fastened upon the winter solstice and turned it into Hanukkah. They used the solstice as a metaphor. For the rabbis, the darkness of the night represented Antiochus's paganism, and the light of the candle represented the faithfulness of Mattathias, the Maccabee family, in holding on to Torah. We have an expression that we use in Jewish life, Torah ora. Torah is light. We use candles and light in all kinds of ways in Jewish life to represent the light of God. So the rabbis took the winter solstice festival and washed it clean of its paganism and gave us Hanukkah. Right next door were the church fathers. And they were trying to figure out, what's this Christianity going to be? So they also fastened on the winter solstice festival and said, the darkness of the night represents a world drowning in sin. The light of the Christ child brings hope of redemption and repentance to the world. And they created a Christmas holiday, which also used this light and darkness imaging. See that? In other words, as different as the holidays are, and they're very different holidays, trust me, right? The fact that we put a menorah in the window and my next door neighbor had lights up on his house comes from the same religious impulse. Use the winter solstice as a symbol of my faith's triumph in a world that was opposed to it. You got that? Yeah. The Maccabees claim that they did it in December. We don't know exactly. They said the 25th of Kislev. The Maccabees in 133 write the book of Maccabees, and they said it happened 133. But the Maccabees, in the book of Maccabees, in the original text, the one that they wrote, had nothing about the menorah. Lights, or dreidels, or presents. Right? What they said was, we beat the Greeks, right? And we cleansed the temple on the 25th of Kislev, a year after they had decimated. So the Maccabees told us as a story of the triumph of war. The rabbis 300 years later said Jews don't celebrate wars. Jews don't celebrate wars because we're pretty bad on it. But yeah, but the rabbis gave us the likeness. Now, so what the Christian community did then was take this folklore material about the birth of the miracle child with the star in the sky, with the light radiant. They took it away from Abraham and Moses and gave it to these Jewish folkloric material and created the Christmas puzzle. If you see one of those, what do they call them? Crèche? Is that what it's called? Or scenes of nativity scenes, right? If you ever see a nativity scene, what you'll see is that the source of light is the baby, right? Like the light of the baby's all shiny. It's because they're in a dark barn. You don't light lights in a barn, you'll burn it down. So the baby's the source of the light. That's the Abraham story and the Moses story. Okay? So far, so good? All right, let's do one. Can we do a little bit more? Are you okay? Have I completely unsettled you? Right? Okay, here's one more. Ready? Okay. The Christian Bible, the New Testament, begins with 3 accounts of the life, birth, the life, the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. They come from 3 different perspectives. The first one is called Matthew. Matthew was likely Jewish, certainly Jewish. Matthew probably lived in the year 120. So he probably lived about almost 100 years after Jesus. Okay? And why does Matthew get it? This Matthew, I think, was a faithful Jew who was struggling with the same thing that the early rabbis struggled with. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in the 70s. Terrible catastrophe. Really, the Holocaust of its moment for that community. How do we go on being Jewish after the destruction of the temple? What do we fasten on? What's the symbol? What is our ideology? This is what the rabbis of the Talmud were beginning to form rabbinic Judaism. Matthew is doing the same thing. Matthew probably lived in Antioch in Syria. And what Matthew does is he decides he has a different story to tell than the rabbis. The rabbis are not authoritative at this point, by the way. It's just one of many different groups of people trying to answer that question. How do we go on being Jewish now that we don't have a temple? Okay? Matthew gets hold of a little book, a book of the sayings of a fellow named Joshua or Jesus. Speaking of Joshua, Joshua is his name. And he finds in this Joshua this idea that maybe God sent the Messiah to redeem us from the Romans, and we killed him. What would that mean? I mean, play that out for a minute. What would it mean if God's Messiah came to the world and failed? Right? Not false Messiah, but a failed Messiah. He couldn't do what the Messiah was supposed to do, but he left us all this teaching. Could we build a new Judaism around the person and teaching of this Jesus, of this Joshua, instead of building it around the temple like we had before? So he begins to put this together. Now, here's the reason why I think that Matthew might be Jewish. Constantly quotes the Hebrew Bible. And the stuff that he quotes in the Hebrew Bible is invariably the Haftarah. In other words, he's a shul-going Jew. And he goes to shul every Shabbos and listens to some little puny bar mitzvah kid read the Haftarah. And he hears in the words of those Haftarahs, those prophetic words from the Hebrew Bible, clues to the identity of Jesus of Nazareth and what might have happened to him. And so he's writing for us. Now, we didn't accept it. There's a very important reason why we didn't accept it. We didn't accept it because to say that the Messiah came means that somehow the world is not where we think it is, that our task in the world is not the same. And at the end of the book of Matthew, he gets pretty angry at it. He has a different strategy for how you live religiously than the rabbis of the Talmud. We'll get back to that in a minute. But take a look at the birth story here. Are you ready? The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, oh, by the way, that name, Jesus Christ, right? Where did it come from? Now, he may have been writing in Aramaic, or he may have been writing in Greek. I think he was writing in Aramaic, which was the half Hebrew Middle Eastern language, and then was translated into the Greek. Because Jesus Christ is a Greek phrase. Jesus is Joshua. Christ is Hamashiach. Okay? The problem is that the Greeks, when they translated this, didn't understand that Hamashiach means the Messiah. They thought it was part of his name. But that's why it's written here with a capital C, right? It's not his name. It's Jesus the Messiah. So this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah, Judah the father of parents of Zerach and Tamar. And it goes all the way down to it's 14 generations from Abraham to David, and then 14 generations from David. Right? It goes down after the deportation of Babylonia. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, he was called the Messiah of Christ. What's the problem with it? Who is descendant of? We have a tradition that says the Messiah will be Ben David, right? Mashiach Ben David. Say that we sing with God, right? So who was the descendant of David? Jacob. Then Jacob gives birth to Joseph. And Joseph, his father, is the descendant of David. But then it goes right on to tell you that, yes, Joseph's not his father. Now, wait a minute. How can it be if you're going to tell me that the Messiah is born of King David, and you're going to tell me that Joseph is descendant of King David, and then you're going to say, yeah, but he's not really the father. Huh? Right? A little strange. You see that? So all the generations from Abraham and David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation of Babylon was 14 generations. And the deportation of Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. That's pretty cool, right? See what he just did there? Now, if I tell you that he skipped it, is it 14 generations? Is it 5? No, because the point of it is more important than the historical act. All right, good enough. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Miriam was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child of the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered doing this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, saying, listen, David, right? Do not fear to take Miriam, your wife, to that which is in the Spirit. She will bear a son, shall call his name Yoshua, and he will save his Yoshua. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. In other words, Hakatu, Shene'emar b'nevi'echa, right? Behold, a young girl, a virgin, shall bear a son, and his name will be Emmanuel. Oh. Because you end up with tsuris otherwise. This is the tsuris you end up with. If a woman is betrothed, sometimes they would betroth a girl as young as like 9. Because betrothal was between two families. Okay? Right? When Joel married the daughter of the Dosics, right? She was betrothed at age 5, and I negotiated the contract, and the Nickersons paid the Dosics enormous amounts of money for their daughter. Right? Right, there you go. the two families got together and decided the kids would get married, and then years later they would actually get married. Betrothal was a financial, legal covenant contract between two families. Marriage was moving in together. Got that? What happens if something happens in between? Well, that creates all kinds of legal issues. There's a whole volume of the Talmud called Talmud Yevamot, which deals with issues. What happens, for example, if he dies? She's betrothed to him, right? What happens if he's lost at sea? She's betrothed to him. Can she marry somebody else? Right? What happens if he doesn't want to marry her anymore? All kinds of issues. The most common thing that would happen would because teenagers were teenagers then, just like they're teenagers now. She finds herself in a family way. Prom night, things happen. And she shows up to the chuppah, to her wedding. My mother used to say, "Atazoy pregnant." Right? So, well, here's the law. In Deuteronomy, there is this case. The Torah has this case. A man marries a woman and cohabits with her. That is, he goes into the chuppah. Chuppah means their bedchamber. But they arranged the marriage. And he was under the impression that she was a virgin. Paid for that. It's an extra plus more. And then goes to spend the night with her and discovers, lo and behold, the girl was found not to have been a virgin. There are ways of finding this out, sort of. Okay? Then the girl shall be brought out to the entrance of her father's house. The men of the town shall stone her to death. Why? Because she committed, yeah, that's considered adultery. Right, that's considered adultery. Even though they haven't been formally married yet, because there was an arrangement, that's considered adultery. So that's the reason, by the way, that we do these two ceremonies together now. We want to make sure that no one finds himself in that way. Right? Where she did a shameful thing in Israel, committing fornication while under her father's authority. Thus you will sweep away evil from your midst. Sorry, what? Well, it could be, right. All right, so what's the case? Here's the case. I happen to think that Matthew, like most people, knew how babies came into the world. And Matthew also, as a Jew, doesn't believe that God makes girls pregnant. Right? So what happened? There's a guy named Joseph, and he's engaged to marry this girl Mary. Okay? And when he goes to her home to have her come into his home, they get married. She's very pregnant. Now he has several choices, right? What does the law say he's supposed to do? Don't take her to the elders of the town, accuse her of adultery, and have her stoned to death. That's pretty radical. What's a more modest way of dealing with this? Didn't want her to die. We have Rahmanis on this girl. And what could you do? Well, it could be, but better than that, thank you, Dr. Otani, right? If he divorced her quietly, so without shaming her, in fact, the name of this law in Hebrew is Motzi Shem Ra, which means shame for her. Point out that she is not a faithful girl. But what if he doesn't want to in any way? So what he does is he says, "No, I reconsider. I don't want to marry the girl. I will pay her because if he divorces her, he owes her the amount of the ketubah. I'll pay her the 400 zuz of the ketubah. And quietly back out of this relationship. She will go back to her father's house and have the baby. And when she has the baby, everyone's going to know that. But then she won't be charged with adultery, but everyone will know that she was a single mother at that point. It's not something that anybody wanted to do. She will be then a marked woman. She will never be married. She will be marked as an unfaithful wife. Won't be stoned adultery. That's like this is not the point of daughter. What did Joseph decide to do? Story. Joseph decides what? Stay with her. How come? How come? Stay with her. Joseph decides to stay with her and to raise the baby as his own. How come? How come? Sorry, what? Yeah, he hasn't met her yet. Why did he decide to do that? No. That's a story that somebody told later. Why did he really do it? Because he's a mensch. Because he's a nice man. Because he has rahmanis. Because he has love. And so I think that this is Matthew's way of winking. You can't tell that story out loud. The kids in the congregation. Yeah, there's Holy Spirit. Where's the Holy Spirit? Holy Spirit, yeah. God came to him and said, you're better than this. Don't hurt this girl. Right? So what does he do? He does something really loving. He takes this girl into his life. She has the baby, and he adopts the baby. He keeps the baby as his own. Jesus of Nazareth was born out of an act of tremendous love. A sweet, kind, generous man who had no reason, no legal reason to do this, other than the fact that he had a good soul. I mean, you understand what Matthew is trying to tell us is I think it's a better story than the other story. Because we all know how babies come in the world. And we know that teenage girls can be indiscreet. Right? And we know that but the guy says, all right, I'm going to take her. I'll love her anyway. Right? And then he was raised, because Joseph sort of disappears from the narrative anyway. We don't hear much of it. His mother, she's around, right? So that's, I think, what's going on here. Now, the next piece of this is, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Well, this isn't one of those areas where translation is destiny, right? Here's the prophet. It's the prophet Isaiah. And the prophet Isaiah is living before 100 years before the destruction of the temple. He's living in the 7th century BC. Okay? The prophet Isaiah is the prophet for the king Hezekiah, then his son, King Ahaz. And Ahaz has a problem. And Ahaz's problem is that he's being recruited to join a conspiracy of kings who are going to fight against the Assyrian Empire. Okay? And God doesn't want him joining that coalition against the Assyrian Empire because he'll lose. So what happens is God says to Isaiah, go with your son Shar-Yashub to meet Ahaz, the king, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool by the fuller's point, and say to him, be firm and be calm. Do not be afraid. Do not lose heart on account of these 2 smoking stubs of firebrands, these 2 other kings who are trying to persuade him to join a war. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not succeed, it won't end. The Lord said to Ahaz. That's right. So Ahaz, the king, says, this army is coming toward my kingdom. What am I supposed to do? And the prophet says, don't join the coalition against them. You'll get destroyed. And the king says, how do I know? And the prophet says to him, this is 700 years before Jesus is born. Right? As for a sign, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Now the Hebrew word is alma, which all over the Hebrew Bible means a young woman, not a virgin. The word virgin is bitula. That's not the word used here. It's a young woman, and apparently the way that the phrase is often, the prophet is talking about a young woman whom the king knows. There's a young woman you know who's about to give birth, probably his daughter. Your daughter is about to give birth to your grandchild, right? The child about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel. God is with us. For before the lad knows to reject the bad and choose the good, the ground, those 2 kings dread shall be abandoned. That before that kid's bar mitzvah, you will understand that God's protecting. In other words, your daughter's about to have a kid. Name him Emmanuel, and I promise you that that kid will be my symbol that God is with you, and you don't have to join that war. That's the original context. Matthew takes that and offers it as the proof text. But Matthew offered it as a proof text in the original Hebrew. But when the Greek translator translated the word Alma, translated as virgin. That's where the virgin birth came from. Now, where did the whole idea of a virgin birth come from? It comes from Greek mythology. Because the Greek translated the Greek mythology and knew that gods are born in all kinds of strange. Hercules, mother was mortal, father was Zeus. Pericles, mother was mortal, father was Zeus. This is a common theme in Greek mythology, but not in Jewish mythology. In Jewish mythology, it's a sweet man who's trying to take care of his children. Decides to cover up his sin and accept the fact that that's how a Jewish reader reads the Christmas story. Okay? And then what happens next? Do you have any time left? What happens next is that in the same way as Moses is a threat to the king, and Abraham is a threat to the king, Jesus is a prophecy given to Herod. King Herod is afraid of the child, so the family has to go to Egypt in order to escape from the wrath of King Herod, who's killing babies in Bethlehem. Okay? Killing babies in Bethlehem to find the Christ child is exactly the same story as Pharaoh throwing babies in the Nile. So what Matthew is going to do is to style Jesus as a new Moses. It's going to style Jesus as a new Moses. Moses took us out of the slavery of Egypt. Jesus takes us out of the slavery to sin. Moses brings us to Mount Sinai for covenant with God. Jesus brings us a new covenant with God. Moses sanctifies us as a holy people. Jesus will sanctify all of his followers, whether born Jewish or not, as a holy people. That's what the next story is all about. Two more last points. Number one is the light. Whenever you see these Christian displays, notice that the light is the main thing. Because it's the darkest night of the year. The Christian community chose this as the way of indicating that the darkness of the world cast in hopelessness and despair is lit up by this birth of a child. There's nothing more hopeful than the birth of a child. Right? Every child that comes into the world we celebrate. With the birth of a child becomes the birth of hope. And in this case, it's sanctified as a sort of cosmic event. All right, one more thing. Understand one more thing? Turn to the last page. Came to America, and we came to New York, California, and in America, Christmas becomes a big deal. We feel, when I was a kid, I felt terribly left out, right? I had to learn 20 Christmas songs for the Christmas pageant, and they let me lead, have a little break, right? When you're talking about Silent Night, and the little drummer boy, give me the break, right there. So what happens is, the Jewish community of America has always had two impulses. Another lecture. One impulse is to fit in. And the other impulse is to remain distinct. And those two impulses bump up against each other, right? To fit in, but to remain distinct. Okay? How do you do that? Fit in, but remain distinct. So what happens is, if you happen to be a people with a lot of talented songwriters, you start, and movie makers, by the way, The Wonderful Life, also part of our world war. What you do is you start writing songs for this season, but you do it in a way that we can celebrate. So the celebration of this time of year is something that we embrace, but we leave out all the parts that are difficult for us to accept. So, ladies and gentlemen, here are the top 10 Christmas songs written by Jews. Right? Number 10, Christmas Waltz. How does that go? No, okay. Sammy Khan. Silver bell, silver bell, it's Christmas time in the city. Jay Livingstone, who used to be Yehuda Livingston, right? Winter Wonderland, right? Chestnuts roasted. No, that's not that. What's Winter Wonderland? What's Winter Wonderland, right? Okay, all right. Felix Bernard, Santa Baby, Santa Baby. All right. Joan Helen Javits, right? Sleigh Ride. Did you know that Jingle Bells was written by Jews? Has anyone here ever ridden in a one-horse open sleigh? Have you really? Have you done it? Really? Is it any? Is it really wonderful? All right. Oh, what fun it is to ride in a one-horse. Right? In Aspen, you can do that. That's right. This is also Jews. I'll be home for Christmas. Just you wait and see. Buck Ram, who is not Buck Ram, but Ramstein or something like that, right? I've got my love to keep me warm. I don't know that one either, but that's. Oh, there you go. All right. This one you all know. Let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. Oh, the weather outside is frightful, but the fire is so delightful. My wife, I can confess this here, but please don't tell her I said this. My wife loves to watch these Hallmark movies. Have you ever, and like, they start like in October and they run till like July, and they're all the same movie. And the image always takes place in some New England town, little town where everyone knows each other and everyone likes each other. And it's always so charming and snowing and there's hot chocolate and peppermints and it's just wonderful. And that's what this is. Sammy Khan lived here in LA. Jules Stein lived here in LA. That's why the Eye Institute is named for him, right? And if you live in LA, what kind of Christmas do you get in Los Angeles? It's terrible. It's 80 degrees. I mean, yesterday was 80 degrees, right? So what do? You imagine this New England snowy Christmas, right? So, the weather outside is frightful, weather hot, because by the way, if you've ever lived on the East Coast or the Midwest and you get 6 inches of snow, it's no fun. It's not let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. Especially if you're sitting on the Long Island Expressway trying to get home from your job and the weather report said there'll be no snow and there's 2.5 feet of snow coming down and I'm trying to get home and it took me 4.5 hours to make what was once a 40-minute drive. Then I have to park the car in Manhattan. This is all done. Anyway, you get the point. Yes. But here too, my daughter lives in Scottsdale, so it's even worse. I mean, right? Here it is, number 2. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping it, right? That's Mel Torme's Jewish, right? And then the number one is I'm Dreaming of a Bing Crosby, Danny Kaye, right? Beautiful, beautiful film. Right now, what's interesting, by the way, honorable mention to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Holly Jolly Christmas, also written by Jews. What's interesting about all these songs is no Jesus. They de-Jesusized Christmas. Now, that's incredible when you think about that, right? When my Christian friends put up those big things, they put Christ back into Christmas. They're absolutely right. Because what we did was we made Christmas palatable. We wanted to participate. So what we did was we created of this holiday this New England image of snowy sleigh rides on peppermint hot chocolate and the sweetness of the season without any of the religious overtone. And that way we could find a place into America. Same thing, by the way, this is the other lecture I was going to do, is the greatest movie ever made, It's a Wonderful Life. Right? It's a Wonderful Life, which is all about the conflict between the two characters, right? Jimmy Stewart's George Bailey, who is the little guy who gives and gives and gives of himself to the community, and then discovers that he's in trouble, and is given the chance to see what the world would be like without him, right? And the evil banker Potter, thank God he's not made Jewish in that movie. I think it's Lionel Barrymore who plays him in the movie, right? That's Drew Barrymore's grandfather, right? Who's this evil guy who would turn the whole, because of his greed, would destroy the whole town. Bedford Falls becomes the ultimate Christian Christmas site. The idea being what's important is family, friendship, unity, diversity, and no Jesus. That's, of course, the greatest Christmas movie around. And as I've told you too many times, it was filmed 10 minutes from there. Bedford Falls is where Lake Balboa is, because that was the RKO Ranch. And that's where the set was. And it was filmed in the summertime, and they had the blot and the perspiration off of all the actors because it was supposed to be a wintertime movie. It's filmed in a dark black and white so that you don't realize that it's California in July. Yes. Right. It's what we did was we created a winter holiday that we could change. That's what these songs do, which is pretty classically Jewish. It's difficult for the Christian world. I mean, the other funny, great story was that the whole notion of giving presents and making this big part of the holiday was really engineered by Isidore and Strauss, who owned Macy's, right? Because this was a lousy retail. And Christmas was a quiet home holiday where you had, roast goose, Dickens, right? And what happened is that the Strauss brothers bought R.H. Macy because he went out of business. They had the pottery shop in the basement of the theater. And they had the pottery shop in the basement. And they bought the department store. And they were, Nathan was and Sear and Isidore was the marketing genius, and they created R.H. Mason's. It's the greatest department store in the world. And one of the things they created was this idea of giving presents and making present giving the core of the holiday. The story, just to finish it really quickly, Isidore and Nathan were both big philanthropists, and their big cause was the pasteurization of milk. Brand new at the beginning of the 20th century. And they went to Europe to advocate for the pasteurization of milk, to a conference in Europe. And Israel wanted to go home, but there was a coal strike in England, and there were no ships going home except one, Titanic. Isidore Strauss was on the Titanic. The story is that because he was very wealthy, he had his maid and his wife, and he tried to put the wife and the maid on the lifeboat. The wife crawled off the lifeboat, and when she said, "What are you doing?" When he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "We live together with them." The story was that as the lifeboat pulled away, the two of them were standing on the deck arm in arm and holding each other. The maid wrote that story. He died on the Titanic. Nathan, his brother, was so grief-stricken that he decided to give away the family fortune to charity. One of the things he did was support the creation of the state of Israel, and so the town of Netanya is named for him, Nathan Strauss. Now, the reason I told you that story is they're the ones who brought Santa Claus into the department store. They had this image of who Saint Nick was, big heavy guy with a beard. Where do you go in New York City to find large men with long white beards? That's right, the Lower East Side. And they would go down to the Lower East Side and recruit these guys, these immigrants, to be Santa Claus. All you had to do was go, ho, 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 right? And the kid would tell you what he wanted, And they would get these guys from the Lower East Side, and they, sit at the Santa Claus thing. And the story, of course, is the little boy gets up in his lap, and Santa Claus says, "Oh, ho, ho, what do you want for Christmas, my boy?" And he says, "No, Santa Claus, no, we're Jewish, and we keep Hanukkah." And Santa Claus leans over and goes, "A gesunden Tag." we had a decisive effect on the creation of this holiday from the beginning and in its American version. Thanks very much.
Thank you, thank you.